What up, YouTube? What up, boys and girls? Yeah, check this one out. Burgees Gang, Part 3, The Execution. So see these apartments up here? Oak Ridge Apartments? Well, that used to be the Nelson Gaol. G-O-A-L. It's like an old word for jail. Yeah, quite a few people were put in prison up there. Few Maoris, few Pākehā. Yeah, it was bad. They used to hang people up there. And that's what happened to the Burgees Gang, so check this out. This is my last episode on the Burgees Gang. This is part 3. You got Burgess here. Sullivan down the bottom. He was the one who would give evidence in court against the rest of the gang members, so he could get away with murder, you know. Above him, you got Kelly over here. That's Kelly. And then Levi at the top. So I'm going to reference this picture in the description. And then this is going to be picture 2. And that's just a portrait of Richard Burgees. Alright. This is Mangatapu Road. It goes up to the Mangatapu track. I actually took this photo myself. And yeah, the Mangatapu track up in the mountains there. That's where Richard Burgees and his crew killed 5 people. This is a picture of a historical monument kind of thing in Canvas Town. Not monument, what's the word for that? Yeah, anyway, that's Canvas Town. And that's where the Matthew party were cruising from when they were trying to get all the way to the west coast, but they didn't even make it to Nelson. So yeah, it's a photo I took in Canvas Town. Cool little historical miners thing. Yeah, I love history, and if you're watching my show, you probably do too. So let's do it then. Yeah, so you can't really see it from this angle, but there's a walkway up there which goes up to Hallowell Cemetery. And we're going to go for a walk up there after I read this podcast and check out where the Burgees Gang were buried in unmarked graves. I've never been up there, so it should be quite interesting. My show is not suitable for children. Kids, click off. And anyone suffering from PTSD, also click off and seek support from your GP. Or call one of the many 0800 numbers available. This gang will discuss murder, armed robbery, the gang themselves getting the death penalty, and the murder of an innocent pack horse called Old Farmer. Why'd they have to kill the horse? That's awful. Anyway, my show is just for educational purposes and not to cause offence to the victims of the Burgees Gang or the cutthroat ruffian scallywag Burgees Gang themselves. Okay, let's recap on the last 2 episodes, and then I'm going to reference this one. It's the 1860s, with the crime spree winding up to a conclusion in 1866. Thomas Kelly, who also sometimes went by the name Thomas Noon, Philip Levi, Richard Burgees, originally called Richard Hill, from London, and Joseph Sullivan have been travelling around the South Island, robbing and murdering gold miners left, right and centre. According to Sullivan's confession, they bumped off 20 people. Now, there's only 6 that we can confirm, but their MO was killing gold miners and burying them in the New Zealand bush, so 20 is actually plausible. You know, hopefully not, but yeah. That's what Sullivan reckoned. Anyway, it was definitely them that killed George Dobson on the 28th of May, 1866. 6 kilometres to the east of the town Greymouth. Yeah, Burgees Gang were drunk when they hit Dobson. They thought he was Edward Fox, the gold buyer, who worked for the Bank of New Zealand. And after they were done with all their skullduggery on the west coast, the gang travelled to Nelson to rob a bank, but decided against the idea because of the heavy police presence. Instead, they travelled halfway to Picton up the Mangatapu track to a place called Deep Creek, where they bumped off 5 blokes. First James Battle, on the 12th of June 1866, he got killed for £3 lousy, which was actually still quite a bit of cash back in 1866, but, not that much money. Next day, they hit Felix Matthew, George Dudley, John Kempthorne, and James de Pontius in a planned attack. Some were stabbed, some were shot, and some got strangled. They even shot the pack horse, Old Farmer. And when they were done with their wicked skullduggery, they headed back to Nelson to sell the gold and stolen loot. Their plan was to travel by ship up to New Plymouth to beat the rap. So New Plymouth is on the west coast of the North Island above Mount Taranaki, but anyway. But the Burgees gang fucked up because instead of laying low for a bit, well, they got drunk and ate nice food and gambled with the locals. Remember, most people were pretty broke in those days, so, see, what Richard Burgees and his crew didn't know was that Henry Moller was following the Matthew party, and he was a bit miffed when he didn't catch up with them on the Mangatapu track. He figured they just made good time and that he would see them in Nelson. But when he got back to Nelson, his friends were nowhere to be found. Henry Moller knew something was very wrong and went to the police. Information for this one taken from, but not limited to, National Geographic website article, Murder on Sacred Mountain, written by Vaughan Yarwood, available on www.nzgeo.com. Briefcase podcast, Mangatapu Murders, available on www.youtube.com, uploaded September 2022. The prowl.org.nz website, Shelbourne Street Goal. Shelbourne Street is where I'm parked right now. But anyway, that's written by Gemma Winstanley, 2011, updated May 2020. And that's available on www.theprowl.org.nz. Later in the show, I'm going to read you guys some articles, but we'll reference those as I go. Okay. Now, not a lot of information is available about the arrests, but they were arrested and jailed at the Nelson Goal. Joseph Sullivan, who would be the one to make a deal with the cops. He said that he was just the lookout, and it was Richard Burgees, Philip Levi, and Thomas Kelly who killed the Matthew party, going on to say that they killed 20 people up and down the South Island. Richard Burgees was furious. He told the cops that it was himself and Sullivan that killed James Battle in the Matthew party, and that Thomas Kelly and Philip Levi were innocent, going on to write a confession that American author Mark Twain thought was a great piece of literature. If you ask me, they all done the murders, but Joseph Sullivan was the only gang member to be spared. But we'll read an article about him soon. Remember, at this time, this case was massive. It was even being reported around the world, because New Zealand was supposed to be a safe country. Of course it wasn't, and it still ain't, but people came here because it was a safe country, and then this happened. So let's check out Richard Burgees' confession then. This is New Zealand history website, Confession of Burgees, Mangatapu Murders, available on www.nzhistory.co.nz. last updated 24th of September 2014. So this is Mark Twain's commentary on the confession. That dark episode, the Mangatapu murders, is one large event in the history of Nelson. The frame of it travelled far. Burgess made a confession. It is a remarkable paper for brevity, succinctness, and concentration. It is perhaps without its peer in the literature of murder. There's no waste words in it. There is no obtrusion of matter, no purient to the occasion, nor any departure from the dispassionate tone proper to a formal business statement. For that is what it is, a business statement of murder, by the chief engineer of it, or superintendent, or foreman, or whatever one may prefer to call him. Okay, that's the end of what Mark Twain had to say. We were getting impatient when we saw 4 men and a pack horse coming. So this is Burgess's confession, but this is not what Mark Twain reckoned anymore. This is anyway. We were getting impatient when we saw 4 men and a pack horse coming. I left my cover and I had a look at the men, for Levi had told me that Matthew was a small man and wore a large beard, and that it was a chestnut horse. I said, "Here they come." They were then a good distance away. I took the caps off my gun and put fresh ones on. I said, "You keep where you are. I'll put them up, and you give me your gun while you tie them." It was arranged as I have described. The men came. They arrived within about 15 yards when I stepped up and said, "Stand, bail up." That means all of them to get together. I made them fall back to the upper side of the road with their faces up the range, and Sullivan brought me his gun and then tied their hands behind them. The horse was very quiet all the time. He did not move. When they were all tied, Sullivan took the horse up the hill and put him in the bush. He cut the rope and let the swags, brackets, a swag is a kit, a pack, a small baggage, fall to the ground. And then he came to me. When we marched the men down the incline to the creek, the water at the time barely running. Up this creek we took the men. We went, I dare say, 500 or 600 yards up it, which took us nearly half an hour to accomplish. Then we turned to the right. Up the range we went, I dare say, 150 yards from the creek. And there we sat down with the men. I said to Sullivan, "Put down your gun and search these men," which he did. I asked them their several names. They told me. I asked them if they were expected at Nelson. They said no. If such, their lives would have been spared. In money we took £60 odd. I said, "Is this all you have? You had better tell me." Sullivan said, "Here is a bag of gold." I said, "What's on the pack horse? Is there any gold?" When Kempthorne said, "Yes, my gold is in the portmanteau, and I trust you will not take it all." "Well," I said, "we must take you away one at a time because the range is steep just here, and then we will let you go." They said, "All right," most cheerfully. We tied their feet and took Dudley with us. We were about 60 yards with him. This was through a scrub. It was arranged that night previously that it would be best to choke them in case the report of the arms might be heard from the road. Okay, so the report's talking about the gunshot. They're using really old words. This is hard to read, but anyway, let's hit it. And if they were missed, they would never be found. So we tied a handkerchief over his eyes. When Sullivan took the sash off his waist and put it around his neck and so strangled him. Sullivan After I killed the old labouring man, found fault with the way he was choked, he said, "The next we do, I'll show you my way." I said, "I have never done such a thing before. I have shot a man but never choked one." We returned to the others when Kempthorne said, "What noise was that?" I said it was caused by breaking through the scrub. This was taking too much time, so it was agreed to shoot them. With that, I said, "We'll take you no further, but separate you, and then loose one of you, and he can relieve the others." So with that, Sullivan took De Pontius to the left where Kempthorne was sitting. I took Matthew to the right. I tried to strap round his legs and shot him with a revolver. He yelled. I ran from him with my gun in my hand. I sighted Kempthorne, who had risen to his feet. I presented the gun and shot him behind the right ear. His lifeblood welled from him, and he died instantaneously. Sullivan had shot De Pontius in the meantime, and then came to me. I said, "Look to Matthew," indicating the spot where he lay. He shortly returned and said, "I had to shiv that fellow. He was not dead." I can't word, meaning that he had to stab him. Right, so to shiv someone, it's like, he stabbed him. Anyway, returning to the road, we passed where De Pontius lay and was dead. Sullivan said, "This is the digger. The others were all storekeepers. This is the digger. Let's cover him up, for should the others be found, they'll think he done it and sloped," meaning he had gone. So they're trying to bury De Pontius in the hope that if people find the murder scene, they're going to think De Pontius did it and then run away with the gold. But really it was the Burgees Gang. Anyway, their plan didn't work, but that's what they were trying to do with that. So, and that's why they buried the horse as well, as if he took off with the horse. You get it? So with that, we all threw stones on him and then left him. This bloody work took nearly an hour and a half from the time we stopped the men. End of article. All right, so that was part of Richard Burgees's confession there. Yeah, now let's fast forward. So the gang's been caught and they've been taken here to the Nelson Goal, where we're filming right now. And it was Friday the 5th of October, 1866. 8:30 in the morning, and the gallows was set at the Nelson Goal. Richard Burgees leapt up the 13 steps to the rope, declaring that he had no more fear of death than he had of going to a wedding. It's ridiculous. I'm not sure if he really leapt up the stairs. I mean, he was a dramatic dude, but he probably just walked up there staunchly. But anyway, as the story goes, Thomas Kelly was less keen. The guards carried him up to his fate, and Philip Levi was calmly saying that he was innocent of all the charges. The hangman didn't care, though. He pulled the lever, dropping the 3 convicts. And to his dismay, he seen Thomas Kelly wasn't dying very fast, so he ran over and swung on Kelly's legs to help him off to the next world. Then they raised the black flag at the Nelson Goal, and the crowd outside went wild. It was horrific, but it didn't end there. The gang was decapitated, one by one, and plaster casts were made of the dead prisoners' heads. These moulds would then be used to recreate an image of the dead outlaws. For what purpose, I don't know. And do they really have to chop their heads off? I think not. But, Yeah, so these death masks, you can actually go see them at the Nelson Provincial Museum, but they're like copies of the death masks. The real ones are under lock and key, which I would recommend. I've gone and checked them out. They're pretty freaky, Plaster casts of dead people's heads. Like, what the hell? But anyway, Yeah, the Provincial Museum is on the corner of Hardy and Trafalgar Street, Nelson. After the grotesque idea of the death masks was carried out, the Burgees Gang were taken out back of the goal to Hallowell Cemetery and buried in unmarked graves. Okay, now let's read up on Sullivan. Yeah, so Sullivan, he escapes death. Now I'm going to read to you the end of page 5, the trial. So the trial is the name of the page, but the actual article is just called Mangatapu Murders, 1866. Written by Ministry of Culture and Heritage. Available on www.nzhistory.govt.nz. The amnesty applied only to the murder of Matthew and his associates. When a separate trial for the murder of James Battle was held on the 19th of September, the jury took just 25 minutes to find Joseph Sullivan guilty. He was sentenced to death. Regardless of how helpful Sullivan had been to the police, the public believed he was a murderer and had got what he deserved. Sullivan claimed he had a deal with the government, and the police supported his plea for a pardon. See, police informants were key crime solvers, and future investigations might suffer if potential grassers doubted the sincerity of deals offered for information. The superintendent of Nelson Province, Alfred Saunders, agreed. Sullivan's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and he was formally pardoned in 1874. And now let's read another page of the same article. Ministry of Culture and Heritage is the author and was last updated on the 14th of August 2015, available on www.nzhistory.govt.nz. Mangatapu Murders, 1866, page 7, Aftermath. What becomes of Sullivan? When Joseph Sullivan returned to Hokitika to give evidence about the robbery of the Hokitika police camp and the murder of George Dobson, a mob called for him to be lynched. Chamberlain was sentenced to 4 years for perjury in the case of the stolen revolvers. One of the accused police insiders was acquitted. James Wilson was acquitted of the murder of George Dobson, with the jury indicating that Sullivan was the most likely killer. Legacy of the murders. Even before the famous Mangatapu murders in 1866, swaggers were looked upon with distrust on the West Coast. And after that date, hardly anyone travelled in those parts without carrying a small revolver in his breast pocket. Sullivan was transferred to the Dunedin Gaol in 1868, where he was recognised in transit. His police escort had to defend him at gunpoint. The captain of the steamer, so a steamboat, transporting the party, refused to carry him. A week later, creatively disguised as a policeman escorting a prisoner, he was again recognised during the stopover in Wellington. But he made it to Dunedin. So yeah, they must have been travelling by a different boat, I guess, a different steamboat, because the first captain refused to carry him. Despite Sullivan's protestations, it was not until 1874 that the governor, Sir James Ferguson, pardoned him on condition that he never returned to New Zealand. He was disguised and taken to Mount Eden Prison in Auckland to await transportation overseas. His first attempt was thwarted when he was recognised and denied passage. He eventually left on the 31st of March aboard the Hindostan bound for London. By December 1874, Sullivan was back in Australia, arrested at his wife's house under the terms of the Influx of Criminals Prevention Act. He received a 3-year sentence. When he was released in 1876, arrangements were made to deport him to New Zealand, but the government refused to accept him. We know nothing of his fate thereafter. End of article. Alright, so obviously there's a pretty high profile crime. I mean, you think back then there's not going to be people recognizing him everywhere he goes, but, you know, they still had newspapers and stuff, and they had pictures of the bloke, so yeah, people recognized him everywhere he went. We don't really know what happened to him. Some people might have think he actually made it back here to New Zealand, but, you know, it's all just too long ago to say. Well, anyway, let's go check out Hallowell Cemetery then, where the decapitated gang members were finally laid to rest in unmarked graves. And then I'm going to read the first half of a biography on Richard Burgees, aka Richard Hill. Alright, let's do it, people. Better lock the car up, I suppose. Oh yeah, let's read this plaque. Check this out. New Zealand Historic Places Trust. Nelson Goal occupied this site from 1850 until 1901. Executions took place here, noticeably those of the Mangatapu murderers in 1866. A girls' school occupied this site from 1908 until 1926. It became Education Board offices, Nelson Region. So yeah, it's pretty crazy. Yeah, I like that cool old plaque, it's mean. So yeah, like I said, I've never been here before. Hallowell Cemetery. Let's give it a go. Oh man, I forgot the article on Richard Burgees. Oh, hang on, I better go back and grab it. Central locking and my car's out. I bought this car at it'd been stolen when the previous owner owned it, and whoever stole the car pulled the central locking unit out, so you got to lock it by hand every time. Alright, Hallowell Cemetery, take 2. Alright, check this out. Hallowell Cemetery. It's got all the names of the people who are buried here. There's a lot of people. So yeah, this is where the Burgees Gang were laid to rest. Now the cemetery is so old that most of the graves aren't even really here anymore. I mean, they're still here, but they're all overgrown. Like, check this one out. Here's one here. Annie Eliza Letitia? Annie Eliza Letitia, a beloved child of Robert and Mary Crawford. That's sad. 10-year-old girl died and was buried here. Yeah. Over here we got sacred to the memory of the beloved wife of Thomas Fox. Yes, obviously there's a lot of people buried here, but the most of the graves are now buried themselves. So yeah, I was going to read the biography about Richard Burgees up here, but it's too windy. I get the feeling the sound's not going to be good when I play this back, so maybe we'll go back to my car for that. Yes, there's another gravestone. It's all broken off. That was a gravestone. You can see it's the bottom of one there. cool chair. Yeah. Yeah, I've never been up here. Hallowell Cemetery. It's pretty cool. In Maori culture, there's not supposed to be fruit trees grown in a cemetery. Maoris wouldn't eat from that. Feijoa tree. And you wash your hands when you walk in and out of a cemetery in New Zealand. I'm not Maori, but I observe the culture, so let's do it. Alright, so there's the apartments where the Nelson Goal used to be. Around here, I'm not sure exactly where the gallows were, but this is where the complex was. Alright, back into the Batmobile then. Another shot of Oak Ridge Apartments. Yeah, if you guys are in Nelson and you want to check this place out, it's just up the Shelbourne Street. It's just up Shelbourne Street. I'm in central Nelson. Obviously not central business district, but not far, you know. Alright, well that was pretty freaky, kind of cool. So where was I? Oh yeah, Richard Burgees. Just get a drink of water if I read this last bit. Richard S. Hill, Burgess Richard, Dictionary of New Zealand Biography. First published in 1990, Tiara, the Encyclopedia of New Zealand, available on www.tiara.govt.nz. Richard Burgess, also known as Richard Hill, was born in the West End of London, England, on 14th of February 1829. the illegitimate son of a lady's maid and someone connected with the horse's guards. When his father disappeared, his mother moved in strained circumstances to the East End. Difficulties at home and at school forced him to join city Arabs at the age 14. So that was some weird gang, city Arabs, that he was a part of when he was 14. He was soon gaoled and flogged for pickpocketing. By 16, he had graduated to housebreaking and was sentenced to 15 years transportation. After 20 months solitary, he was shipped to Melbourne. Arriving in September 1847. Released on conditional pardon, that is, unable to return home until his expiration of his sentence, Dick Hill, as he was then known, briefly worked as a stonemason, but soon resumed a life of crime. His offences included robbery, forgery, rustling, and murder. The smart, dapper little fellow, 5 feet and 4.5 inches, fresh complexion, brown hair, hazel eyes, according to a wanted poster, found easy pickings among the Victorian goldfield diggers. He spent the proceeds on gambling, liquor, and women. Sentenced in 1852 to 10 years for a robbery, of which he always maintained he was innocent, he experienced brutality of the Melbourne gaol and the prison hulks. He tried to escape from those floating hells of misery the second time in 1856. Led by infamous bushranger Captain Melville Frank McCullum. So he's talking about trying to escape from floating ships. They were called prison ships they had back in the day. If you're wondering why they're called floating hells of misery, yeah, it's a prison ship. But anyway, 3 people died, including a policeman, but the 9 defendants at the murder trial, including Hill, escaped hanging on technicalities. Within a month of his early release in 1859, on a ticket of leave, Dick Hill was arrested again for armed robbery. So Dick Hill is Richard Burgees, but I'm sure you're following along just fine. His use of an alias enabled him to disguise his past, and he received a light sentence. In October 1861, he was discharged from Pentridge Stockade to escape police vigilance. In January 1862, he departed for Otago Goldfields. So he left Melbourne for Otago, which is South Island, New Zealand, because the police had it in for him. Anyway, here he teamed up with various Australian colleagues and began to prey upon the miners. His closest mate was a man he had known in Pentridge, Kelly, alias Noon. So I guess that's prison, that Pentridge prison where that guy Chopper Reed was in. I mean, obviously it would be like a new version of that prison. I mean, maybe that prison was so old it was still running in the 80s and the 90s over in Australia. I really don't know, but I think they're talking about the same place, Pentridge. Yeah, anyway, when in March 3 policemen attempted to bring Burgess, as he was known, most of his time in New Zealand, and Kelly in for questioning at the diggings town of Weatherstons, the 2 escaped amid police gunfire. On the subsequent capture, they were charged with armed resistance to the law, although they swore that Kelly's gun had gone off only once, accidentally. Burgess and Kelly received 3 years hard labour for the firing charges and 6 months for possessing a stolen weapon. Even some of their digger victims were uneasy about these developments, since the evidence for any firing at the police was rather flimsy. Burgess vowed to take revenge on society when he was released. Wow. After a failed escape attempt, Burgess was considered the ringleader in every refractionary outbreak in Dunedin Gaol. Tighter discipline was introduced, mutiny broke out, and Burgess was lashed. He is said to have determined that he would take one life for every lash received. Burgess and Kelly were released on 11th of September 1865 and soon left town to escape close police observation. The Otago police escorted them from Dunedin to the provincial border. There they eluded the Canterbury police and made their way to Hokitika. Okay, so Canterbury is above Otago. Christchurch is mid-Canterbury, for example. But anyway, they travelled over to the other side, to the west coast, to Hokitika. All right, let's finish this up then. The local police had insufficient resources to place them under surveillance, so the pair with others resumed a roving life of crime on the west coast goldfields. In the gangs which formed the specific jobs, Burgess was always the leader. In Hokitika, Burgess indulged in gambling and other sinful excesses, and lived with a young woman called Carrie, whom he left when she became pregnant. My poor bird saw me occasionally when she ever pleaded for me to set her free from her shame, Burgess confessed later. From the end of April, when Burgess met up with former publican and prize fighter Joseph Flash Tom Sullivan, who had just arrived from Victoria, his criminal activities increased. The West Canterbury Police Headquarters at Hokitika were twice robbed to produce arms and uniforms for a bank robbery at Okarito. Okay, I think they mean West Coast. Canterbury is on the other side, but that's what the article says anyway. Burgess and Kelly were acquitted on charges relating to this by the preemptive strategy that included perjury evidence by Sullivan to escape surveillance. The threesome went north to Greymouth on the 26th of May. 2 days later, a young surveyor, George Dobson, mistaken for gold buyer E.B. Fox, was held up and then strangled. It is not known which members of the gang committed this crime. Burgess and Sullivan later blamed each other. And that's the end of that. Yeah, I gotta tell you, reading those old articles with all that crazy old language and stuff is really difficult, man. It's like some weird words for stuff back then, you know. But yeah, that's my show about the Burgess Gang. I hope you guys liked it. And if you haven't already, go back on my channel and check out some other on location ones. One where I go to Dobson, which is the town that George Dobson was killed in. That's why it's called Dobson. And I filmed one there, and then there's another one I did as well. But yeah, this is part 3, the Burgess Gang. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.